So for my talk, so it'll be structured with me just, first of all, giving an introduction to the physical structure of the country, because that really provides the sort of literally the bedrock on which the story that I've been talking about, it being super rich for wildlife, is based on. And then I'll talk very briefly on the key sites for endemic birds, and then we'll sort of romp through the 35 recognized endemic birds. I have a lot of slides. I have something like 105 slides to get through, and as you all don't want to sit here for 5 hours, you'll find I don't talk to all the information on the slides. A lot of that information is really for people who will be watching the video and want to go through it at their own pace. But equally, if you want to take your phones out and take pictures of any of the slides, feel free to do so. I'll be using it more as a prop, just to tell a story and run through things. But I also start by saying a big thank you to various people who supported me over the years, especially some of the corporates, as well as sort of NGOs and governmental organizations. Because we are pushed for time, I can't obviously run through the whole list, but I will call out Jetwing Hotels and Jetwing Eco Holidays, their wildlife subsidiary whom I worked with for a number of years, who continue to support me, including most recently when I went to Sri Lanka. I did 4 days in Trincomalee with Jetwing to work on a couple of National Trust book chapters. Also, a big thank you to the hundreds of photographers who have over the years contributed images and also given me permission to use it on my presentations, and the publishers, so like the National Trust in Sri Lanka and in Britain, Brad Bloomsbury, and especially John Beaufort, who make it possible to get these books out, to develop skills in Sri Lanka and to promote tourism. So we need to start by understanding what makes Sri Lanka special. So it's not just the fact that it's on the equator, because we always associate rich tropical biodiversity close to the equator. But look at the Horn of Africa. All of this is near the equator as well, but it's very dry and desert-like. So Sri Lanka is actually benefiting from things that happen at a planetary scale. The southwest monsoons, which sweep across from the west, from the southwest, and then another monsoon system which comes from the northeast. And that's combined with a mountainous core at the top, which then captures the rain. And so we harvest those monsoon winds, and we get the rain that is needed. The mountains also makes it very structurally complex. Now there's another interesting thing that's happening. Sri Lanka is not totally to the south of India, but actually it's a bit of it is north of India, a bit of it is south of India. So when the southwest monsoons come, they pass over the Western Ghats, which intercept the rain. So a lot of the rain that's coming from west of India is shed over the Western Ghats, and those dry winds come over the northern half with no rain to shed. So the northern half is very dry, whereas what's below India, that stretch of the monsoons come in carrying the rain, they meet the mountains, and they shed a lot of water in the southwest quadrant. So although it's a moderate sized island of about 60,000 square kilometers, you have this continental diversity. You have very desert-like arid zones in the northeast and the southeast. Here and in the lowlands and in the mountains, it's very wet, and then again, it's very dry here. And you can cross from the wet zone to the dry zone and the mountains fairly quickly. In fact, in one day, you could go dry zone, wet zone, highlands. Then there's another very important thing, and really, it's the fact that Sri Lanka has perhumid forests. Now, this is a message I should have got out a lot earlier. I mean, everybody in tourism ought to know what perhumid forests are, and that makes Sri Lanka particularly rich. So perhumid is where there's no pronounced dry period, which means like if you have lowland rainforest and montane cloud forest, there's a continuous supply of rain, which plants need. There's good sunlight, and then obviously, if you got the right sort of mineral composition in your soil, you got all the ingredients you need for very high plant productivity, and animals feed on plants and other animals feed on those animals. So you've got the nutrient cycling, you've got the engine for life going at top speed all the time. So Sri Lanka is not a subset of India. It was. So if you look to the left, between 23 and 34 million years ago, a lot of peninsular India and all of Sri Lanka had per-humid forests. But those rich rainforests in India dried out. So although India has rainforests, they are seasonally dry rainforests. Sri Lanka still has per-humid forests, shown in the dark green here. But you can see India has lost its per-humid forest. Now to find another patch of per-humid forest, you have to go east to Southeast Asia, so Thailand, Malaysia, etc., all the way to New Guinea, or you'll have to go west to Central Africa. So Sri Lanka is quite unique. And this is another reason why the number of endemic species per unit area is disproportionately high. It also makes for great wildlife viewing because, as I said, you've got this wet zone, dry zone, and the clouds. So when you look around the island, you get very different habitats, from dry, open, savanna-like habitats in the northeast here to very broad rivers and lush rainforests in the west. So in the west is the kind of thing you see. There are man-made habitats. There's over 2,000 man-made wetlands, some of which have become very good for wildlife. And then the natural habitat is everything from cloud forest to lowland rainforest. It's very lush and rich. And then in the rain shadow, you have the dry zone, which has created the right environment for elephant herds to form, and leopard, and the kind of East African safari kind of experience. So it combines both of these elements, and the richest rainforests in South Asia are in Sri Lanka because of this per-humidity. And again, in the interest of time, I don't want to delve on all the details, but when I talk about Sri Lanka being super rich, there really is a case to be made, and it's all these different factors, like it's a continental island, it's not a volcanic island, ancient origin, the humid forests, the diagonal monsoons, the ranges, etc. Plus, you've had evolution doing remarkable things like these incredible species radiations, like with frogs. Sri Lanka has more endemic species per unit area than probably any other country in the world. Costa Rica has more frogs on an absolute basis, but for a tropical island, the species, the endemicity per unit area is very high. And then the human factors have also contributed to something like the gathering, which is the largest recurring gathering of wild elephants in the world. Now, it would be tempting to think that some of this is connected with land bridges, and that's usually the case with the islands. If the island gets connected to the mainland, things come over, the land bridge closes because of glaciation and sea levels sort of declining, and those animals get trapped there and then they speciate. It's a nice little theory, but unfortunately in the case of Sri Lanka, that's not what happened, because a lot of the species crossed over before land bridges became a significant factor. But it also means because they crossed over a long time ago, as the per-humid forest shrank between India and Sri Lanka, some of the species that had crossed over got marooned in those parts of Sri Lanka, and they continue to evolve and speciate. So some of the things came over like 40 million years ago. And some of them obviously started off with Gondwana when the southern land mass broke up. India and Sri Lanka rafted and collided with Asia, creating the Himalayas. And some of the stuff in Sri Lanka continued to stay there and evolve, like the dipterocarps in the rainforest. So Borneo and Malaysia, which have a lot of these timber trees, the dipterocarps, they actually got it from the Indian plate because the Indian plate collided and skidded and some of them jumped off, and then Borneo now has maybe 800 species of dipterocarps. Sri Lanka has about 52 and 51 are endemic. So how do you look at this in numbers? So if you're trying to understand how super rich Sri Lanka is, you've got to compare like with like. So it won't be fair to compare the species per unit area in Britain or any other temperate island with a tropical island. You'll have to compare a tropical island with a tropical island. So let's compare it with Borneo, Madagascar, and New Guinea. They're all about 600,000 square kilometers each. Sri Lanka is 60,000, which means they're 10 times bigger. Now, the larger the land area, the more species you can hold on to. So the species per unit area for those islands ought to be bigger than Sri Lanka. Okay, but Sri Lanka bucks that trend. And also you need to compare with a similar history and endemism. So if you look at Singapore, Singapore is technically an island. It'll have more species per unit area than any of these 4 islands, but it's a recent island, so it's almost like part of Malaysia because they have hardly any endemics, just a handful. So it doesn't have this ancient history and endemism that these 4 islands have. So if you look at, let's look at the inland snakes as an easy example. Now I could have taken the average of the 3 countries, but to amplify the change, what I did was I looked at the species per unit area and I indexed the lowest one at 1. So in this case it's New Guinea. So if New Guinea is 1, how much more are the other 2 islands? And you can see they're approximately almost the same, which is what you would expect. Because, you know, large tropical islands, large, long history, a lot of isolation, etc. But if you look at Sri Lanka, for inland snakes, it's 12 times that. Okay? And for reptiles, amphibians, you can see the others are clustered together. Okay, so I've taken fresh dragonflies. But you can see Sri Lanka is very much higher, and it's because of these things. With endemic birds, you can see that actually New Guinea is much higher than Borneo and Madagascar, and that's because New Guinea has a very interesting geological history. Because as the continental plates slide below one another, New Guinea was formed by these what are called geological terrains, like layers of land surface came and it formed a matrix, and it probably, you know, forced the evolutionary pace. So which is why it's got a lot of species. And in a way, it's similar to Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka has, you know, all these physical factors sort of probably got the engine working. So when you take this very high richness of species, especially endemicity, plus other factors, it makes for a really good all-round destination. But I'm not overegging the argument. I'm not saying it's the best, or it may be arguably one of the best or the best all around, but if you look at the components of what wildlife tourists look, I can always find other countries, you know, which will be better, like East Africa will have big game. There are other countries which are really good for whale watching. If you look at skilled guides or tourism instructor, you know, maybe, you know, countries like Britain will be really good. So I'm not over-egging the argument, but when you look at it holistically and say, when you take all these factors, is there a country that has all of this? It's quite hard to beat Sri Lanka. So for more on this, you can like Google for this article I've written called Why Sri Lanka is Super Rich for Wildlife. That's sort of aimed at a popular audience, and if you really wanted the science behind it, then this book I have flagged here, The Ecology and Biogeography of Sri Lanka, Context of Freshwater Fishes by Rohan Pityagoda and Hiranya Sudhasinghe gives you a lot of the science behind it. Okay, so let's look at the bird life. Always start by putting birds in context. And when I'm sometimes leading walks, I playfully ask people if you had to pair close relatives, would you pair a crocodile with a land monitor or with a bird? And of course, since you all are an informed audience and you all know the phylogenetics and the evolutionary history, you know that birds and crocodiles are like closely related. But of course, unlike crocodiles, birds have speciated a lot. So it's like, I think last time I looked at this, there were like nearly 11,000 species of birds, which are split into 105 families, which fall into 35 orders. Now, other than the endemics, is Sri Lanka a good place to bird watch and learn your birds? And the answer is yes, because if you look at it in terms of the scientific orders of birds, you know, Sri Lanka has, out of like 36 in total, Sri Lanka has 22, so more than half. And if you look at it in terms of families, Sri Lanka has a third of the bird families. So Sri Lanka is a very good place to learn your birds. So it's very handy for somebody like me because I grew up there. So when I came here, I already knew quite a few of the European families as well as the Asian families. And so I just put a stat here that like from a house in the capital Colombo, I can hear the calls of 23 species from 8 orders, and this is when I'm on my laptop remote working. So there's not too many places in London where you can be remote working from home and hear 23 species of birds calling. So again, I mean, I know we're here to talk about the endemic birds, but it's also important to realize how important Sri Lanka is for migratory birds. So something like the blight-streaked warbler, you can see it winters largely in that part of Asia, including Sri Lanka. And actually, perhaps a more pronounced picture would be with something like the Kashmir flycatcher, where you know almost all of its population may be coming to places like Sri Lanka and the Western Ghats. And there are also the interesting things like cooperative breeding. So I was actually surprised when I looked this up that 9% of the world's birds have been recorded as cooperative breeders. And in the UK, you know, you think of the long-tailed tit as a bird where you know, the siblings from the previous litter might help the parents with the next litter. And it's not confined to birds, you know, mammals like jackals do that as well. And here we got spectacular birds like the blue magpie that do it, and then the yellow-billed babbler, which is a common garden bird, does that. So the list of birds at the last count is 35. It may increase with more work being done, so I'm not going to read through the whole list because we will come to them. But I've pointed out that it's not like a radiation of species, and it's not like one family that, you know, one bird arrived and, you know, so many millions of years later that from that found a bird, there's like 15 species. So it's happened across 22 families. So it shows what I was saying about the long history and the structural complexity and things. It sort of worked on lots of different bird families to create this list, and there are sort of passerines and non-passerines. Passerines particularly are very famous for this incredible radiation, and I think the BOC had a talk on that. Now, quite a few Sri Lankan scientists have been doing proper science on them. So I thought I'll start by showing some of the work people have done. And a very long-term study has been on what are called the mixed feeding flocks, and that's taken place in Singharaja. And 59 species have been recorded in these collaborations. Feeding flocks could be a talk on their own, but I won't have the time to go into all the details, but there are benefits like foraging efficiency and security when you gather in herds, and here different species are forming into herds. So you can say a lot of species are making use of this 59. The average in a feeding flock is 12. Regularly you'll have 19 species, and the average flock size is 41. What makes them particularly good for tourism is that they're very stable. So I've encountered feeding flocks in the neotropics and in Malaysia and stuff, but they're like they go so quickly, or you know, they don't show themselves very much. Whereas the Sri Lankan birds seem to be like Instagram trained because they hang around and they show themselves. And okay, so this is Professor Kodagama. So he worked. So he's done a lot of science, and so he had this PhD student called Eben Goodell. Now, this work was begun before Eben arrived in Sri Lanka, and it's one of the longest continuous field studies. And you can see the number of papers that the PhD student produced. And I haven't updated this list. This list is more. And Eben now works in China, and he's had a number of Sri Lankan students working with him there. So I'm going to have a little digression to talk about an idea which I've written, which I put a proposal, but I've written as a popular article on how countries like Sri Lanka and generally middle income or developing countries can access some of this foreign intellectual capital. I'll be very brief. So the idea is that a country like Sri Lanka will create a special visa, which is as easy as to get as a tourist visa, but you say that you're coming to work with somebody in the University of Colombo, and you're either getting it in the category of an intern because you're a student in a British university and you want to come and spend 3 months or 6 months working in a rainforest, or you may be an academic and you're coming on an exchange program, and the idea is that with a few clicks, you pay your $25, you get the visa, you arrive. This would make it, and similarly, if you're coming to do a PhD, you say coming to do a PhD, you say who you're doing with, within seconds you get your visa and you come and do 3 years. So imagine if you had like 100 PhD students, each producing 10 papers, that's 1,000 papers, but that means you had a huge number of Sri Lankan scientists who have been put down as co-authors because you're working collaboratively with them. And then lots of Sri Lankan scientists are getting access to your know-how and the latest in thinking, the latest software, the latest technology. It's knowledge transfer. The knowledge transfer is two ways, because somebody from the UK will also learn about how to work and operate in rainforest conditions. So there's learning both ways. But in terms of the human traffic, it'll be one way in that this is really to get people from G7 and G20 countries to come to places like Sri Lanka and work so that Sri Lankans can access the international science community through that. There's also another side in terms of the economics, and this is where you might come as a volunteer. So there are a lot of people in the UK who've worked in science or conservation, and you may have retired and you got your pension income, so financially you're okay. But if a conservation NGO or a safari lodge is willing to pay for your flights and host you, but they can't pay a salary, you might still be willing to go because that's the kind of thing you love doing. You love to work with local scientists and guide them in science, or educate them as a naturalist. And in the audience, we have Nirosh Pera, who runs Makini Lodge, and if there's a visa like this, he would be very happy to host people for a month, and then another lodge could host them for another month. Now, to avoid any controversy, I've said this can't be for paid work, and you don't get special privileges, so the local host will have to have necessary research permits or whatever is required. Okay, and then of course, so this is an article I drew on the science to write a popular article, but then some of these people will come back and they'll be posting on social media or writing articles and sharing the science. As I said before, the bird waves happen all over the world. So this is me going to the Jalai Highland Resort, which at one time was very good. But again, the bird wave was very short-lived. You had to be there at dawn. They came and ate the moths that had collected on the lights, and they were gone. And the science that's coming out is very interesting. So there's this bird called the Sri Lankan drongo or crested drongo. So it's like the gang leader and the policeman. It makes a call and it summons the flock. And he says, right guys, get down to business. And then it's also like the security guard, so if like a hawk eagle flies in, he will fly out and engage, sort of like a anti-drone attack kind of thing. So it defends a flock, summons a flock. It's also a bit of a thief because he will give the alarm call and scare a bird so that it will drop a tasty morsel and so that it can steal it. So it's got a bit of a mixed personality. The orange-billed babbler is another nucleus species. They're always in flocks, and so when they hunt, they disturb. They might cause some prey items to fall to the ground, so that the Sri Lanka Spurfowl that's foraging on the ground will benefit from that, but also more pairs of eyes to look out for danger. And different species have a different strata. So like the red-faced smallcock, which you see here, is usually in the canopy. You'll never see them coming down to the ground. And the ashy-headed laughing thrush is always in the undergrowth. And then beautiful birds like the scimitar babbler, which also sings very beautifully, and there's a duet, and quite often the male sings sort of seemingly at length, and then the female sort of adds the last note and sort of gets the last word in, so completing the duet. The blue magpie was also the subject of a study. And again, interesting things have come out how it can, imitate the calls of different predators, and these are context sensitive. Depending on what it's trying to achieve, it'll mimic different things. It's a crow, so as you know, anything in the crow family, they are like the primates of the bird world. They're very intelligent, and they are very good at reacting intelligently to what's going on about them. And like the jackal, as I mentioned before, they are corporate breeders, as are things like this really charming birds, the yellow-billed babblers. And Sampath Seneviratne did a simple experiment with color dyes to show that you can do citizen science even in a garden and study some intricate animal behavior. So you don't necessarily need high tech. He just used vegetable dyes with a water pistol and color marked some of the birds, and with that he was able to demonstrate something that's going on. So this is Sampath Seneviratne, a guy who's like a really good birder. He's like saying like maybe 1,000+ species in South America when he worked there, and now he's in Sri Lanka. And he does a range of work from running a molecular genetics lab to satellite tagging to other easier field work which doesn't need tech. He's got a bunch of students, and in a way he's continuing with the tradition of people like Sarat Kodagama, who was the first to do a PhD in ornithology and has been very influential in creating a generation of people who are interested in birds at a scientific level, as well as something that's popularized and accessible to lots of people. And one of Sampath's students did an interesting study on the genetics of the endemic Sri Lanka white-eye and the Indian white-eye. So what you would have expected is that the Indian white-eye arrived in Sri Lanka from the Asian landmass, and then some of these birds sort of moved up into the highlands, and over years the highland population was separated from the lowland population, and it speciated. But it appears that's not the case. They both arrived on different colonizations. So the Indian white-eye is a subspecies found in Sri Lanka, but the Sri Lankan white-eye arrived independently and then speciated. And in that paper, they talked about the different models. Is it one species arriving and then one continuing as that species, one splitting, or two different things arriving? Again, I don't really have the time to go into details, but all of these papers are available online. White eyes in in general are a very interesting group. They're known as a super speciator. So you can see there are 135 species of white-eyes. So it just shows how quickly they morph into a new species. And again, I think for people who are watching this on the video, they can take the time and run through the details. Another thing that Sampath and his team looked at in terms of the molecular genetics was this issue that you had in Asia a number of species of woodpeckers that had a golden back. So like this guy. So if you go to the north of the country, you see these guys with the golden back, but like in the capital Colombo, they have a red back. So for a long time, the theory was that this is the species that's in India and Sri Lanka and other Asian countries, and somehow an endemic subspecies had evolved in the south. But when they looked at the genetics, they actually find that this bird is a different species. And this is just looking at Gerard Gorman's book, just to show how you had these different golden back species, and we thought ours was this with two subspecies. But now we know that they're two different species. Now, molecular genetics is not the only way to look at it. And I think at one of the BOC meetings, we had Tobias talking about the Tobias criteria, where you look at the morphometrics, the external appearances, and you do a scoring system. Are they visually different? Are the calls different? Is the size different, etc.? And you score them. So you can do this sort of thing and score them, and then again you find, whether you approach it from genetics or the Tobias criteria, you find that the scores support that they are two different species. And this team has been very successful. They've been publishing it in publications like the ORC. And genetics is not obviously the only thing to look at. There are other interesting things. So when you look at a peacock, then you come to the story of why does a peacock have this amazing tail? So people like Wallace, I think, Russell Wallace went for the handicap principle, saying it is a sign of fitness. If you've got to carry this big bulky tail around you, it shows the ladies that you are in top form and you're fit, you'll be a good father. But Darwin, who's better known for his theory of evolution through natural selection, said maybe the ladies like prettier boys. Okay, so that's a theory of sexual selection, that the beauty in males is because the females see beauty and they just select for more and more beautiful males, and then beauty becomes a trait which you get evolved for. And of course the beautiful males have to respond to that by being fit enough to be beautiful and carry a long tail around. Okay? And then another thing you see with birds is this sexual dimorphism because of that. So maybe because the females are selecting for pretty boys, you find that the males are different from the females. And you see that in quite a few of the endemic birds, very pronounced if it's looking at the Sri Lanka jungle fowl versus the female. Less of a difference, but noticeable enough in that here's the male Layard's parakeet and the female has an all grey head. I know with the light streaming through the window, it may be a bit hard to make out the colors. Okay. And then, even facial ornamentation. I mean, this is not confined to human beings that we want to wear rings or patterns on the face. Look at this amazing eye decoration that the Sri Lanka magpie has at close quarters. Now remember, it's a crow, and the crow is also quite a diverse family with maybe 100 species around the world, or maybe less. I had to look it up. But you can see how different they are. And there are other things you could study, and there are papers being published by the students in the Colombo or Sri Lankan universities, where you look at the ecological roles, such as being a disperser of fruit. So this Attica is a tree, it's a ficus that grows rapidly. A bit of a problem actually if you're doing building maintenance in cities like Colombo, because the Sri Lankan Barbet, the crimson-fronted Barbet, which is an endemic, will come and place some of these on your walls and roofs, and if you don't get rid of them, they will bring your building down. So here's a crimson-fronted Barbet, an endemic bird, probably photographed in my garden actually, because we had a ficus tree before it threatened to destroy the whole house and we had to remove it. And Barbets also have these rictal bristles, like what nightjars have. So although they look like whiskers, they're actually modified feathers. May help them to work their way through very dense canopy. So there's been an explosion of molecular work over the last 20 to 30 years. So certainly in the last 10 to 20 years, there have been lots of revisions of where the birds were placed. So I'm not going to go into the details, but just sort of drawing attention to some of the things that have taken place. Publishers, of course, love this because it means they can come to me and say, Gehan, is it time for a revised edition? Because haven't things changed, and haven't the birds moved around from this family to that family, and haven't their names changed, etc. So just a few days ago, I had an email saying they want to do a 4th edition of the Naturalist Guide to the Birds of Sri Lanka. This is a small pocket guide by John Burfoy. So it keeps the books fresh. Now, if you're going to find them, again, there's a lot of stuff I've written which is available online, so I'll just focus on the main ones. So you're really going to target the southwestern sector where if you're after the endemic birds. But you could even start in Colombo, which is good. You could go to, Colombo has lots of fantastic wetland parks where you can see some of the endemic birds. But the top sites are the Singaraja rainforest, where if you go for a walk, half the trees you see will be endemic. And that's where things like the red-faced malkoha and blue magpie can be seen. And you can go up to the Horton Plains, which is cloud forest, or Kitulgala, which is intermediate. It's sort of mid-elevation. So if you could only do three of those sites, you could just do 3. But there are sites like the Bodhina lowland rainforest, which is just an hour and a half away. So this is what Bodhinagala looks like. It's just an hour and a half from Colombo. Singaraja, when the roads are in a good state, it could be 4 hours away. You can see, tall the dipterocarps, the emergence. Kitulgala, the mid-elevation that I talked about, and Horton Plains, which is really beautiful, up in the cool highlands, dwarf, sort of elfin forest. There are also sites like the Labugama reservoir, which is about an hour plus from Colombo. There's no public access anymore, but lots of private people, like like the people who run Rambas Reserve, Nalaka Rambukpota, has bought 50 acres of land and reforested, and Fazana and Neil Dobbs who here have also bought a property and they're reforesting it. So it's surprising that you have these sometimes 10 acres to 50 acres of private land, which people are now managing as reserves, and you get in the mix there. So if you start in Colombo, it may not seem very promising, big built-up city. But as I said, endemics like crimson-fronted Barbet, they're there in the city center. You hear them. And then things like the red-backed Flameback, even in the busiest parts of Colombo, because Colombo has lots of these old trees. You see them. It's sort of quite unexpected. You're in a shopping mall or something, and you come out and there's a big tree, and then you see one of these birds there. And if you go to a place like Desaru, then you see some interesting behavior, like they come down to the ground after rain to get at things like worms. And things like the Sri Lanka swallow. Let me do a time check. It's 7:16, so I better speed up, okay? Singharaj is really the place you want to go to for some of the endemics. So things like the swamp-winged thrush, they are active early morning, and they quite often they come onto the roads, they sing beautifully. But as the sun comes up, they retreat into the shadows. The other thrush that seems to be permanently living in the shadows is the Sri Lanka thrush. At one time it was considered a subspecies of white thrush. This is quite a difficult bird to see, but you know, they are getting habituated. After the last Galle Literary Festival, I took Helen MacDonald, who wrote H's for Hawk, on a bird watching tour, and one of these birds flew and landed on a perch. Everything was perfect for photography, but the light was so low, I had to switch to manual focus. And to my dismay, I had also accidentally turned off the image stabilization. So I got pictures that were perfect, except for a slight bit of blur. But I think the birds are getting used to people. So here's the Sri Lanka thrush, which is photographed by my friend Ajit Ratnayaka, again on a private land, and the birds, you know, he did have a sort of a hide, but the birds had become more accepting. The Sri Lanka blue magpie was again a very shy bird when I first went to Singaraja. It took me 8 trips to see one. And now, if I'm staying at Martin's Lodge, when I'm having breakfast, a group of them will arrive, pick up scraps, and they go, and it's just part of their morning routine. You know, birds, they just know when, you know, they're being accepted. The Sri Lanka Spurfowl is one of the 2 pheasants which are endemic, the other being the jungle fowl. Again, quite a difficult bird to photograph. So whenever a pair starts to show up, you'll find the bird photographers from Colombo all sort of head to where the sighting is happening. And the Sri Lanka drongo, which I talked about before, has a beautiful call. I mean, I could just spend a long time listening to it. And it's a great mimic. Sometimes I think I hear a kingfisher calling, and I turn and look, and it's actually this guy. And the common drongo, which again you get in Colombo and other cities, and it's a garden bird, again is quite good. It even mimics cats. And the orange-billed babbler we met before, a very important nuclear species. This bird, which is another babbler, despite the name of laughing thrush, or, you know, very, yeah, I mean, it is in the family Timalidae, so it is a babbler by a different name. It's surprisingly scarce. It tends to be found just only in a few forests, and is still quite shy. The scimitar babbler, on the other hand, is an endemic that's adapted to home gardens as well. So especially in the hills and the highlands, this is a bird that seems very comfortable visiting the garden. And as I said, they sing beautifully. So it's really great if you're, you know, sitting in an estate bungalow with a cup of tea in the veranda, and you have endemics like this turning up. The green-billed cuckoo is another very scarce endemic. It's known just from a handful of sites like Singaraja, Kitulgala, Bodhinagala had it. So again, there's something about its habitat specificity that, you know, it sort of likes this sort of bamboo forest. And the very first paper in the Orient Bird Club's folktale was actually written by this guy called Martin Vijay Singh, who ran Martin Simple Lodge until he passed, and he wrote it in Sinhala, and I translated it into English. So I was very happy to be able to help in that way. And both the red-faced malkoha and the green-billed cuckoo are actually cuckoos, and it just demonstrates how diverse the cuckoos are. Because we think of cuckoos like things like the common cuckoo, which is what we are used to saying, but, you know, in Asia you will have like the malkohas, which are either canopy birds or like this one, which is actually a ground bird. But more commonly, it's the cuckoos that will be birds that sort of forage on the ground. And then things like the Jacobin cuckoo are more sort of cuckoo-like in that you'll find him in the mid and upper canopy. Whereas the red-faced malcar is, 99% of the time you're going to see them in the high canopy, and it's quite difficult to make them out. So this is a female because it's got this white, the white of the eye is white, whereas if it is a male, it would be brown. So again, another example of sexual dimorphism, although it's very scarce. So this endemic is also surprisingly scarce. Starlings, again, a very diverse family of birds with lots of species. And this endemic, again, is known only from a few good quality forest sites. Although, as starlings are powerful flyers, they fly around and you may see them in other sites, but in terms of where they breed, you've got to go to places like Singaraja and Kitulgala. So this is actually a picture taken by Nirosh, who's in the audience. And Lear's parakeet is another interesting endemic. Like the ring-necked parakeet, they occur in small flocks. You hear them, and if you arrive in Singaraja, you know this is part of the acoustic signature of the forest, these birds calling harshly and flying around. But they can also extend into the dry zone where you have riverine habitats. So the distribution maps I have shown are very approximate to give an indication of where they are found. But if you go to things like eBird, and if you look at the maps, you can see how these species, because they are strong flyers, can turn up anywhere and make seasonal movements. And the Sri Lanka mine is another bird that's a powerful flyer. And although, again, it likes good quality rainforests because it's a powerful flyer, they might make foraging movements, and they might be 40, 50 miles away from good quality rainforest. But to have like a resident population, again, you need good quality forest. The hanging parrot, on the other hand, is an endemic that, I heard 30, 40 years ago, you could even see them in Colombo, but now they tend to be, definitely are going to see them in good quality forests, but also in adjoining what I call sort of village garden habitats. So if you have like an estate and you have kittul trees, you will see them there. So they're a bit more tolerant, and in the dry zone, you will find them on riverine forest, but not in typical dry zone forest. The crimson-backed flameback is another endemic which seems to prefer the wet zone all the way from the lowlands to the highlands. It does need good quality forest generally, but it does extend all the way into the dry zone as well. But you're more likely to see or hear it in Singaraja or in Horton Plains. But you will find it when you travel around. The Legs Flapeca is one of our tiniest endemics. Quite difficult to see because they like to sing from very high up. But when I visited Nalaka Rambutputa's Rambas Reserve, which is about an hour or so from Colombo to the Labugama Reservoir, I was able to hear it many times because he's got like 50 acres and the reservoir forest is in like another 100 plus acres of old lowland rainforest. So that would be an absolute tourism jewel if they reopen public access. But lots of bird watchers have bought private land around it, and they're sort of maintaining it as their private lowland bird watching reserve. So the Serendipitous copsal was the last bird to be described to science from Sri Lanka, and it was a endemic that had not been discovered in the sense it was not an endemic that was in view, but that science didn't do the molecular work and split it as a new species. So in 2022, what was known as the white drum shama, which we would see everywhere, was elevated to being a full species. But this was a bird that had been overlooked because its call sounded very much like an amphibian, so it was just overlooked. But Deepal Barkagoda, who is one of the country's top field ornithologists and very experienced bird tour leader, and the country's best wildlife sound recordist, has produced a number of recordings on birds, tracked it down, and then with the well-known Pamela Rasmussen described it as a new species. And it's got a few interesting physiological adaptations, like how its sort of legs are structured so that it can perch in this angle on thin stems. So not every owl would be comfortable doing that all the time. So there's another endemic owl, the chestnut-backed owlet, which is in the same family as the jungle owlet, which is widespread. But the chestnut-backed owlet, again photographed by Niroshus in the audience, is one who likes the wet lowlands and the wet highlands. So again, another largely a southwestern endemic. If we leave the lowlands and we go up into the mountains, okay, I'm going to have to race through. Then you find things like the yellow-fronted barbet. It's found from the hills to the highlands, and it's got this lovely call which sort of reverberates around the valleys. And again, a very characteristic signature of the highlands. You also have the Sri Lanka wood pigeon, which is an endemic. Looks very similar to the one in India, but it's always been recognized as an endemic. Like pigeons, like all pigeons, they're powerful flyers, and they might occasionally make their way into the lowlands. Then you have the whistling thrush, which is very interesting because it's actually designed to be seen in low light, in ultraviolet. So other whistling thrushes see it in ultraviolet, and they can see these very interesting patterns they have on their plumage. For us, they might look uniformly dark, maybe with an occasional patch of purple showing through. So this is a bird of highland streams, and you expect them to be insectivores, and they largely are, but occasionally they will take vertebrate prey as well. So it's an endemic bird eating an endemic, what is probably an endemic frog. The black-throated munya is found in the highlands. It was an endemic once. Sadly, it's been demoted. But we are hoping that maybe with further work, we might find that the one in Sri Lanka is an endemic. Then you have, your share of little brown drops of the endemics, like the bush warbler, which really is a montane bird. It's not that rare, but you got to learn its call and be able to track it down. Whereas this endemic, the Sri Lanka white-eye, is a well-behaved endemic because it comes in large flocks into gardens in the hill country. So you can be sitting on the veranda enjoying your cup of Ceylon tea, and this bird will turn up. And so will another bird called the yellow-eared bulbul, another montane endemic, the dull blue flycatcher. However, it can be seen in the lowlands, like where the knuckles sort of meet the lowlands. So because it's close to montane habitat, you might get it, but generally you would go to the highlands. And here's the yellow-eared bulbul that I mentioned. So I think because of time, I'm just going to really zip through without talking much, but if you go to the dry zone, there are other birds, like the jungle fowl, green pigeon, grey hornbill, wet zone and dry zone, wood shrike, black-capped bulbul, brown-capped babbler, and Sri Lanka charmer, which was the most bird that was recently elevated as being an endemic. Right, so I think with that again, final thank you to everybody who supports the work and has made it possible for me to bring all these publications out to showcase Sri Lanka's biodiversity. And thank you again for being here. And I'll
Thanks very much indeed, Gehan. You're clearly a front man for the Sri Lankan Tourist Board.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Encourage increased levels of visitation to the islands. Question.
Is there any tagging studies that have been done in endemic birds in terms of follow quality?
So is the question, am I aware of any tagging?
Yeah.
Yes, so Sampath Senivaratne's team have tagged a few species. The one I've seen them sort of publicizing on social media is they tagged Huglin's gull, which comes from northern latitudes. So, I mean, it's always been known that its journey is 6,500 kilometers from where it's breeding in the Arctic, in sort of Russia and, countries in that Arctic Circle. So it's 6,500 kilometers down to places like Manna in the northwest, in the dry zone, and then 6,500 kilometers back. But with their radio tagging, they were able to pinpoint the route and show how some of his journey takes it over the Himalayas. They've also tagged some of the shear waters, and I think there's interesting stuff coming out of that as well. But the tags are actually quite expensive, so this is another restraint, and again, which is why I'm saying not just Sri Lanka, but if any developing or middle-income country adopts this visa idea and makes it easy for people from G7, G20 countries to work with those countries, they might have access to the budgets to do more of this exciting kind of work. So I don't know that Sri Lanka will take forward the idea I'm putting out, but it's in public, and any one of 150 countries could take that idea to accelerate their science.
Very much a related question. There's a number of bird ringers in the room here tonight. Is there a Sri Lankan bird ringing scheme? And if not, has there been sort of expedition ringing, or are the countries supplying rings in the history of ornithology of Sri Lanka?
Yes, so the Field Ornithology Group of Sri Lanka, which I mentioned, they run bird ringing camps. But it's not the kind of effort that happens elsewhere. And also there's a structural constraint in that at present you need a group like the Field Ornithology Group of Sri Lanka to go to the Wildlife Department and get a letter in writing saying, yes, you can go there and spend a week bird ringing. Whereas people like Sampath Senivaratne, as part of a long-term study, they may get a ringing permit for a year or even longer in that particular site. So when I was in Sri Lanka, I suggested we adopt the international models between Britain and Europe, where you train ringers and you give them a license, and then they can ring anytime, almost anywhere. I mean, obviously not in a national park where you need to get entry permits, but you could put up a mist net in your backyard and ring. At that time, that met up with a lot of resistance, but Jetwing Hotels supported some of the bird ringing at their hotels. And some of you may have heard of John Hornbuckle, who was at one time the world's #1 bird lister or something. So he came and did some ringing. And I think they trapped perhaps the first Eurasian wryneck that had been seen in Sri Lanka. But they were a bit slow in trapping it because I was already on my way back to Colombo when they did that, much to my dismay. But I was not going to drive back just to see that. Yeah, so it happens, but not in a way that you could go and do some volunteering work.
Yes.
I guess, again, slightly related to that question, but how big is citizen science in Sri Lanka for stuff like birds? So like Merlin and eBird things. And is that used a lot in scientific research?
Yeah, so citizen science actually has become quite big in Sri Lanka. So if you do go to eBird, you find there's a lot of take-up, there's a lot of sort of data now, and when you look at the maps and things, you're seeing birds turning up in places you didn't see them before. That plus the growth of social media, because a lot of photographers are going out taking pictures and posting on Instagram, Facebook, etc. But also there's been a very good take-up of iNaturalist. So Sri Lanka has lots of people posting things on iNaturalist for different groups. And it's also a way for them to identify the species, because quite often you just don't have field guides for those groups. If you photographed a hoverfly or a bee, there's no field guide. When I returned to Sri Lanka, there wasn't a field guide for dragonflies, for instance. So luckily I was able to collaborate with a guy called Matjas Bejanek from Slovenia, and Karen Conniff, who was an American who was a resident there, and that's another story which I don't have time to go into, but I was able to harvest that expertise and start developing simple pictorial guides, and then a field guide which covered about 70 species. But given the absence of field guides for other species, iNaturalist has become like a default field guide. People upload their pictures and try to figure out what it is.